Hello, everyone. My name is Polly Terzian, an associate with the NYU John Brademas Center for the Study of Congress. I'd like to welcome you to tonight's program, Changemakers in Focus, a conversation with Kenneth Roth, former executive director of the Human Rights Watch. The Brademas Center's Changemakers in Focus series is a set of conversations with leading changemakers drawn from a range of fields, from politics and journalism to the arts and tech. These discussions will explore the common themes and unique experiences of how interviewees are making impactful change on politics and society today. Kenneth will engage in a thought-provoking discussion this evening with Washington Post breaking news reporter and NYU alumna Maegan Vazquez. Following Kenneth and Maegan's conversation, there will be a brief audience question and answer session. I will have a handheld microphone like this one that we can pass around so others can hear your questions. Ken is also the author of his latest book that came out in February of this year, Righting Wrongs, 3 Decades of the Front Lines Battling Abusive Governments, which is available for purchase after the event in the main lobby. I can assist you with that. And Ken has also said he's more than happy to sign copies of books that are purchased. So without further ado, I'd like to hand off the program to Maegan.
Thank you so much. By the way, my mic is on, right? You can hear me? Okay. Thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure.
I'm so excited to talk about your book, Righting Wrongs. This book, to me, felt a little bit like part memoir, part lessons learned, and part road ahead, what's going to be next for human rights. I first want to start off by asking you, what was the motivation for writing the book, and also the impetus for you moving into the human rights field?
Okay, well, two separate questions.
Yeah.
First, why did I write the book? When I would tell people that I defended human rights, they would kind of look at me in this puzzled way, like, well, that's a nice thing to do, but how do you possibly get anything done? Because in a country like the United States, where generally there is the rule of law, people know that, you can sue the bastards, you go to court, you bring in the ACLU. But in most of the countries where Human Rights Watch works, that's not an option. The courts don't have the capacity to restrain governments. And so we've had to develop a way of putting pressure on the political branches of government to force them to respect rights. And it's not obvious how you do that, so I thought I would really explain that. And, the tools are not that complicated. One is starting from the premise that in today's world, every government has to pretend to respect human rights. And, they all fall short at some level. But when we can go into the country and carefully investigate, what are the human rights violations being committed, and then report on and spotlight that discrepancy between the haughty pretense and the ugly reality, that's embarrassing. It's shameful, it's delegitimizing, and governments will go to great lengths to try to stop it, often attacking us. But ultimately, they realize that they're not going to get rid of the bad press without changing the bad conduct. And that's when we begin to make progress. So the kind of more straightforward part, the part that most people have no idea that we do, is that we have developed relationships with a series of governments that have influence and that purport to use that influence to defend human rights in their foreign policy. And we will meet with them, sometimes you have to nudge them, but we will get them to withhold what a target government wants until its conduct improves. And every despot, every dictator wants something. And so it could be arms sales, it could be a military aid package, it could be preferential trade benefits, it could be an invitation to a fancy summit. Whatever it is, we try to persuade the German government or the French government or the British government or Japanese or European Union, you name it, to not provide that until the government changes. And so that's a real 1-2 punch, one reputational, one diplomatic and economic. And then in extreme cases, we actually get people prosecuted. That's become an option in recent years that was not an option when I started. So, that's the essence of it. But what I do in the book is, rather than just go through that abstraction, which I've just done with you, I tell stories. I illustrate how we did it. And the chapters of the book are really organized around some of the biggest challenges we face. Because, what's the point in taking on the easy cases? So I describe how we dealt with China, how we dealt with Russia, how we dealt with Saudi Arabia, and I try to do it, Israel. So I try to take on the difficult cases and show how even in those cases, you can make a difference. Now, in terms of how did I get started? I mean, a big factor for me was my father, who fled Nazi Germany as a 12-year-old boy in July 1938. He grew up in Frankfurt and moved to New York. And he spent, 5 years under Hitler as a young boy. He was totally aware of what was going on. And, his parents were very open with him, my grandparents, and trying to kind of navigate, the brown shirts at the playground or the possibility that his father would be arrested, and the kids who were young had to know all of this. And so I grew up with these kind of Hitler stories, what it was like to be a young Jewish boy living in Nazi Germany. And it made me very aware of the evil that governments could do. My father was fortunate to leave before the Holocaust started, but he was still very much threatened. And so that was a big part of what pushed me to try to devote my life to preventing atrocities like that from recurring.
But you did have a career before you joined Human Rights Watch. I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about what you did before.
Sure. Well, I mean, the reason I had a career before I joined Human Rights Watch is because there were no jobs doing human rights. I mean, I knew once I was in law school that I wanted to do human rights work. But I mean, it was such a kind of tiny beginning field, So I signed up for the one human rights course that was offered at my law school, and they canceled it. And so, to this day, I've never taken a human rights course. I mean, I'm currently teaching 2 of them at Princeton, but I've never taken one. I then went out into a non-existent job market. So Human Rights Watch at that stage, which had a different name, was called Helsinki Watch, had 2 employees. And I just assumed, I'm never going to get a job. So I started working as a lawyer, mainly as a federal prosecutor in New York, and would volunteer nights and weekends doing human rights work. And I was assigned, I mean, this is indicative of how, kind of very basic the field was at that stage. I was assigned to handle martial law in Poland when, at Soviet instigation, they clamped down on the Solidarity trade union movement. And I did that for, 4 or 5 years and, loved it. And finally, a job opened up, and they reached out to me and I grabbed it. So, all my friends were leaving the U.S. Attorney's Office and becoming partners at law firms. And I went to this tiny, obscure group no one had ever heard of. And it was the best professional move I ever made.
So tell me more about those early days, the infancy of what we see today as this robust human rights advocacy, I don't know, industry, would you say? What were those early days like? Tell me more about, the first few years when you were in that deputy position before you moved into the executive director position.
Well, I mean, I joined the organization as deputy director, which is kind of a, a highfalutin title because there were only 20 people there, so I really was a researcher. And I was somewhat haphazardly thrown into, like I was assigned Haiti because none of the people who covered Latin America spoke French, and I did. So, I suddenly became the Haiti expert and was kind of there repeatedly as the Duvalier dictatorship fell and as the army decided they didn't want to allow elections, So that was kind of a very dangerous but very formative experience for me. But I ended up going, odd places. I was in Kuwait just after liberation. I was in Albania as the communist dictatorship was falling. I was in Czechoslovakia just before it fell, for a big trial there. And I mean, I tell these stories because they were a bit haphazard, but it gave me a real appreciation of the importance of the research that really is the basic foundation for the work of Human Rights Watch. Because, without that ability to really, carefully document what's happening, that's what gives us credibility. That's what enables us to shame governments. That's why we can meet with the State Department or various foreign ministries, and they listen to us because we know stuff they don't know. And over time, as the organization grew and as I became executive director, I couldn't do the research anymore. I just had other stuff I had to do. But that was very formative in terms of just appreciating, one, the difficulty of the fact finding, but also the importance of getting it right, and of frankly deferring to the expertise of the researchers because they know their country or issue better than anybody else.
So one of the comparisons that you made in the book that I thought was very interesting was the evolution of Human Rights Watch and similar groups alongside the evolution of communication and the speediness in which we communicate with the world thanks to the internet. Can you tell me more about how Human Rights Watch has evolved over the years as a result of the internet?
Yeah. No, I mean, one point I make in the book is that one way to understand the evolution of the human rights movement is in terms of the evolution of communications technology. And if you think about it, it makes sense because the first human rights movement took place, when information traveled by sailing ship. And you couldn't know what happened yesterday, So you could only take on big, long-lasting issues like the slave trade or women's suffrage, And, it was only, say, in the mid-19th century that the telegraph emerged and, suddenly you could sort of vaguely follow, a war or whatever. But, Amnesty began in 1961, Human Rights Watch in 1978. For the beginning, even international telephone calls were too expensive to do regularly. And so you would travel to a country, once a year and do an investigation. The rest of the time you would write letters. It was very slow. So the classic report would look at, a year's worth of stuff. And what changed all of this was email. And the most revolutionary example of that is that Human Rights Watch actually shared a Nobel Peace Prize for the campaign to ban anti-personnel landmines, where we got a treaty. And that was made possible by email. If that campaign had started, it wouldn't have worked a few years earlier. But suddenly the email made it possible to build a global coalition of NGOs, quickly and cheaply. And then to assemble a coalition of about 60 governments that were able to stand up to Washington, Moscow, and Beijing, none of whom wanted a landmines treaty. And that, that just organization was made possible by email. But the other thing that email allowed was real-time reporting. And until then, that was not really possible. When you had to, fax stuff or use telexes, it was, incredibly painful and slow. But with email, you could, learn about something today and try to stop it from happening again tomorrow. And with email, I then created an emergency program for that purpose, where these were experts in wars who would, jump into an armed conflict, and we would learn about something and try to stop it, And that was, really revolutionary, completely sped up the metabolism. And then, of course, the big, kind of more contemporary change was the emergence of smartphones and social media. And they, permit, two things broadly. One is organization. And I think the first example of a social media-led movement was the Tahrir Square demonstrations in Egypt, the early stage of the Arab Spring. But I think we also tend to underappreciate how hard it is today to hide something. Because, and I think back, I talk about this in the book, when the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia murdered 2 million people, most people were not sure what was happening. And that would be inconceivable today. Everybody has a smartphone, everybody has access to social media. It is really hard to hide things. And obviously there's a lot of garbage on social media, so you've got to parse through it. Human Rights Watch has, a staff of open source investigators whose job it is to verify and corroborate what's posted. But at least in terms of leads, it's great, and it's very difficult for governments to hide. Now, obviously governments can use this to their advantage. They can spread disinformation. But I still think the truth matters. And in many ways, the best evidence of that is if you look at these governments that are, mastered disinformation, they've got these great propaganda departments, they still all censor. They don't have confidence in their disinformation. They still try to prevent their people from gaining access to the truth. And that, speaks to the power of the truth, even in this age where, some people say, are we in a post-truth society? Trump speaks about alternative facts. No, people who want to get to the truth still can, and that's still powerful. Governments hate it when that happens because that's what holds them to account.
I think that's fascinating because, talking about the garbage, as you put it, I do wonder how many more problems are created as a result in your field because of the internet, because of the spread of radicalization online. Is that something that you see increased concern within human rights?
No, sure. In other words, the deliberate spreading of divisiveness is, it's a classic strategy. You see that, by the far right in many democratic societies. I think it's a big part of what Russian propaganda is about, because, the Russians kind of want to prove that democracy doesn't work. And so the more divisive, the more stymied it can be, the better for them. Because I talked in the book how, unlike Xi Jinping, who tries to present a positive image for China, and, there's a lot you can dispute there, but Putin doesn't have a positive image. He talks about, traditional values, which is, trying to go back to the 19th century. But his main PR strategy is just to say that everybody else is terrible, so don't bother him. And this divisiveness that he spreads is, aimed at promoting dysfunction among the established democracies. So he can say, we're all terrible, just leave me alone.
Speaking of Putin, at the beginning of the book, you talk about Syria and Russia's involvement. And at the time, when this conflict was going on, 2012, 2015, you talk about how Putin, in some respects, still tried to keep up the guise of being a proponent of human rights and arguably decency. We see a very different Putin today. Could you tell me a little bit more about your observations as somebody in the human rights space of Putin's evolution?
Yeah, well, there was a turning point with the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And, we can talk about why he did that. Clearly his COVID isolation was a big part of it. But I think that he, in the end, was threatened by the existence of Ukraine's democracy. And, Putin has always been terrified of a color revolution. And if he sort of looked at kind of what could spark a pro-democracy revolution within Russia, I think a big fear on his part was this, big Slavic country that spoke a lot of Russian, that was also Orthodox, that was right next door, that had a democracy. And so, going back to 2014 and the Maidan revolution there, he's been fixated on Ukraine. So I think that that's what motivated him. I think that's what Trump today doesn't appreciate when he just says, oh, we'll draw the ceasefire lines wherever they are, and who needs a security guarantee because, Putin's going to be satisfied with, parts of 4 provinces in the east. No, that's not what this is about. But Putin was not always like this. And I opened the book actually in discussing Idlib province in northwestern Syria. And, Putin played an essential role in Syria in a number of respects, even earlier than Idlib. He was the key to forcing Assad to, dismantle part of his chemical weapons program. He was the key to, under pressure, allowing humanitarian aid into rebel-held territory cross-border from Turkey. These were all things that he resisted, but he was susceptible to pressure. And so what we decided to target really, beginning 2017, 2018, was the very deliberate bombing by Syria and Russia of civilians and civilian institutions in Idlib. Idlib was the last area held by the armed opposition at the time. And there were about 3 million civilians living there. And every day they were getting bombed. And they're not just, people, but they were targeting the hospitals, the markets, schools, apartment buildings. And the idea was to kind of make life unlivable, drive out the civilians, and then it'd be easier for Assad's army to come in and take on the rebels. So this was, a blatant war crime strategy. we documented it, we wrote about it. But to say that, oh, Assad is attacking hospitals when he's already, used chemical weapons and starved people and executed, tens of thousands, we were not going to add much to his, poor reputation. So we decided to target Putin. And, this being before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, he still cared about his reputation. And so at that stage, we said, well, how can we influence Putin? Trump had come into the office here, so the US government was not an option. Trump was not going to pressure Putin. So we focused on German Chancellor Merkel, French President Macron, and Turkish President Erdogan. And this was a 2 to 3 year effort involving multiple meetings with, the most senior officials, work in the media in these 3 countries, and gradually raising Idlib on their agendas with the aim of getting them to twist Putin's arm to stop. And they gradually started doing that, but Putin resisted. And he would agree to sort of a partial step, kind of a distancing of the front lines. But it wasn't until March 2020 that finally Putin agreed to stop. And for 3 years straight, there was no more bombing of civilians in Idlib. And it picked up a little bit after that, but then it ended definitively because Idlib is where the HTS rebels came from that in December overthrew Assad. And I chose this example because clearly it made a big difference for the people there, 3 million people who suddenly didn't have to worry about death from the sky. But it also shows that even in a really difficult situation where one person's beyond shaming and the other's tough nut to crack, Putin, you can still make a difference if you figure out the right strategy, if you figure out what does Putin care about. And what he cared about was maintaining good relations with, those 3 countries or more broadly with Europe. And so, that was the strategy we pursued and it worked.
So tell me more about the process in which Human Rights Watch would identify an issue, deploy people on the ground, and write a report, put pressure. Tell me more about that process.
Okay. I mean, it's kind of a 2-step process. Step 1 is, if I could raise the money to hire a researcher, where do I assign the researcher? And there's, an internal competitive process. The factors that go into it are pretty straightforward. It's like, where are the worst abuses? Where can you make a difference? Where is there a gap in coverage? Where is there value added? Once you hire a researcher, then they pretty much set the agenda. And they consult with local activists. They ask the same kind of questions, where can we make the greatest difference? Where are we value added? What are the gaps in the defense? And they will then propose, an annual plan, which, I and my more centrally based colleagues would review, but with a lot of deference because the researcher is the expert. They very quickly know their country or issue better than virtually anybody else. And so it's not really my job to second guess them. I mean, I want to test them, make sure they've thought it through. But if it's, if it's well thought through, we just say, go for it because, I wanted them to have that ownership. But they then really, they're the ones who set the agenda.
So by the time you left, how many researchers were there?
Well, the overall staff was 550 when I left. And
it's just 550.
No, but I mean, they weren't all researchers, but I mean, about 120 of them were maybe researchers who, I mean, if for the Washington Post, I mean, they would be the foreign correspondents. Mm-hmm. And then we also had advocates in key capitals around the world. We had a communications team. But no, I often, I mean, if you thought about Human Rights Watch as a media company, which we weren't, but there were still parallels because we were collecting and publishing information. We were clearly one of the top 10 media companies in the world, in terms of global coverage, which is odd to think about because it's.
So tell me more about what it was like to try and scale Human Rights Watch, expand it. You talk in different parts, you write in different parts of the book about some of your donors, some of the issues you've had with some of those donations or trips to Libya, was it right? Am I getting that right?
Yeah.
And then, of course, your biggest benefactor in recent years was George Soros, who is portrayed as a liberal boogeyman. So, you know,
Yeah.
how do you navigate?
I don't portray him as a
Right.
boogeyman. You know, but-
Sorry, I should,
Yeah,
s- I
right.
should.
By others,
say
right.
portrayed by others as a liberal boogeyman.
Right. In fact, I tell a great George Soros story, which is worth repeating. But after George W. Bush, after his torture and his Guantanamo and all this, the US lost a lot of credibility as a defender of human rights. And it became clear to us that, while our research was already global, we had to globalize our advocacy and our communication strategy so that we could enlist a much broader range of influential governments to defend human rights. And that took money, And so, to build Human Rights Watch was a gradual process. When I took over, the budget was, I think, 6.5 million US annually. When I left, it was 100 million. And that, that was a progression. But at a stage when the budget was about 45 million, I wanted to take this step and really turn Human Rights Watch into a genuinely global institution. And Michelle Alexander, our development director and a close colleague for 25 years, made one of these, pyramids of, a donor pyramid. And they're classic for a fundraising campaign where you have, 100 people who are going to give $1,000. It kind of builds up. But at the top of the pyramid, she was somewhat out of her mind. She put somebody who was going to give us $10 million a year for 5 years. And nobody had ever come close to that. It was like a completely pie in the sky. But she kind of had done the math and she said, that's what we need if we really want to pull off this campaign. And so I thought, who could possibly do this? And I went to George Soros and I said, you are the only person in our universe, because he'd been a donor for a while, who has, both the inclination, the possible inclination, and the means to do this. And I outlined this vision of kind of really a global institution. And I then came to the ask and I said, George, would you give us 10 million a year for 5 years? And he thought about it for a moment and said, I'll do it for 10 years. So he doubled my ask. He made a $100 million commitment. That doesn't happen every day, But it was transformative. It really enabled us to go forward with these plans and really build all these advocacy and communications offices around the world.
Were there any lessons learned from some of the donations that you received and any conflicts?
Well, look, in terms of fundraising, I tell the story in the book when I became executive director, I had never raised a cent in my life. That was by far the scariest part of the job. And of necessity, you've got to learn. And one thing I learned over time was that the best way to fundraise was to tell impact stories. Because, everybody's for human rights, so everybody was willing to make a token contribution as a kind of a personal statement, like I'm for human rights. But to make a real investment, they've got to see that it'll make a difference. And, as I explained at the beginning, how we got stuff done was just not obvious. So the best way to get people to understand was to tell stories about how we did it. And that's really kind of what I did when I fundraised, is I told stories. So that was that's the kind of the main lesson I learned. We, did occasionally have problems, mainly on Israel, where a donor would just not like that we're criticizing Israel. And I reviewed all of our work on Israel-Palestine. I made sure it was, factually accurate, that it was principled, that we treated Israel the same way we treated everybody else. And once we met that standard, we published. And if a donor was unhappy with that, you live with it. Not that many people were. Most people who contributed to Human Rights Watch understood that we're not going to treat Israel differently. In fact, we would be discredited if we treated Israel differently. But there are a handful of people who are just looking for some excuse to exempt Israel. And those were not the donors for Human Rights Watch.
So throughout your book, you sprinkle in meetings with every government under the sun, basically, including some leaders who are labeled as dictators, despots. How did you get these leaders to engage? How do you get them to engage and not only, talk to you in emails, but to literally be in the room with them?
Yeah. Well, I think one thing we figured out is that the smarter governments, even if they're ultra repressive, understand that there's an advantage to meeting with us because they can make their best case. Because I mean, I want to hear what their defense is. It makes our reporting stronger to understand how the government justifies what it's doing. We'll modify our reporting if we're getting something wrong. And I think, governments recognize that. They also, some of them just want the benefit of pretending to respect human rights by meeting with us. That doesn't tend to work that well. But, I mean, I tell a story in the book where under Gaddafi, he at one stage was trying to clean up his act. He wanted international investment. And so he, dismantled his nuclear program. He was, paying compensation to the victims of the Lockerbie bombing. He was doing a number of, things to clean up his portfolio. His biggest remaining problem was his human rights record. And so he understood that he needed to get through our review. And so working actually mainly with Gaddafi's son, Saif, who was later charged by the International Criminal Court, but for a while was portraying himself as kind of pro-human rights, we got into Libyan prisons and were able to do, pretty open investigation. And the one condition was that we would present our findings to the government before publishing them. So I went to Tripoli and met with the government and said, these are our findings. And they started yelling at me, and just like on and on and on about how you completely misunderstood. This is so wrong. You can't possibly publish this, And I think they just thought that they would like beat us into stopping, And so I kind of let him go on for a while and then said, you guys don't seem to understand. We are holding a press conference in Cairo in a few days. One way or the other, we're going to do that. And the journalists are going to ask, how were your meetings in Tripoli? And we can say they were terrible. All they did was yell at us. Or we can say they were actually very productive and they've agreed to reforms. Which should it be? And the official said, we got to talk to our superiors. And so we went back to the hotel. Next morning, woke up, hung out. And it wasn't until about noon that we got a phone call, we're willing to see you. And so we went back and it was like a different government. They had these folders piled on the desk with the case files for all the prisoners we were worried about. We'd given them 171 political prisoners that we wanted released. They were all released within like 2 to 3 weeks. And they just realized that they were not going to get any place by budgeting us. And if they wanted their clean bill of health, they had to change. So that's how it happens.
Tell me more about the power of shame in your work.
Well, I mean, as I said earlier on, these days, everybody has to pretend to respect human rights. And, even somebody like Xi Jinping, who you think is like, above this, when we tried to put China's treatment of the Uyghurs, their detention of 1 million Uyghurs out of a population of 11 million, when we tried to put that on the agenda of the UN Human Rights Council, which would have been a very shameful step, they were desperate that that not happen. And we ended up losing by 2 votes. It was very close. But Xi Jinping himself was calling heads of state, trying to get them to vote with China. So it shows that, people often say, oh, we're in a post-shame environment, you got people like Trump, but it's actually never true. People always care about their reputation. And I think even Trump, if you come at Trump, frontally and say, you're violating human rights, he would say, what are those? So it's not, a frontal approach won't work, but Trump, like everybody else, cares about his reputation. And, what Trump wants is, he wants to be seen as this, this master negotiator, this savvy deal maker. And, that gives us leverage in terms of moving US foreign policy, because if, look what's happening in Ukraine right now. If he goes forward and has this, ceasefire in place with no meaningful security guarantees, ignoring that Putin is going to, just kind of rearm and reinvade and complete the process of crushing Ukraine's democracy, he will be seen as having been bamboozled by Putin. He will be seen as a naive negotiator. That's not what Donald Trump wants. So I think that gives us some leverage with this guy who, would love to just wash his hands of Ukraine and, be friends with his, model autocrat. But he does care about his legacy. And the last thing he wants is to be seen as the Neville Chamberlain of the 21st century.
And so you see that pattern of wanting to preserve a reputation by using human rights and saying, hey, I'm a proponent of human rights across all governments. That's what you're saying.
Well, you mean in
Across all
terms of,
leaders
well,
that you've met.
you have to always find the angle. But one of the points in the book is there is always an angle, and between reputation and other things that leaders want from the international community, there is always something. And, you just have to analyze the situation. But, as I go through in the book, even the most dire situations, you can improve them by figuring out that angle and then using that to put pressure on the target government.
What are the strategies that you deployed when responding to some of your biggest critics? I'm sure they're all across the globe in different corners of the world. Is it a deployment of the facts? You emphasize so frequently of Human Rights Watch's reliance on the facts being solid. Tell me more.
Yeah, that's the key. In other words, there are two things that are important. One is getting the facts right. The second is being principled. But most of the arguments are about the facts. And typically we're attacked for supposedly getting it wrong. But we don't get it wrong. We're actually super careful. We don't publish until we know we're right. We have that luxury. We're not compelled to publish anything. And so we're still unsure, we don't publish. In essence, we're not like a newspaper. We have this deadline. We can just wait until we get it right. But so when a government starts attacking us, we almost welcome it because they're going to lose. And it kind of in an odd way raises the visibility. And they'll. I tell the story with Paul Kagame, the Rwandan president, how a decade ago, when the M23, this rebel group that's now in Eastern Congo, when it first emerged, it was, back then as well, backed by the Rwandan military. And Human Rights Watch has an office in Goma, the principal city in Eastern Congo. And we documented the Rwandan military support for the M23. And the M23 is this horrible force that runs around and, executes and rapes and the like. And so we put out a report, and Paul Kagame said, no, you're wrong, And he, had a very good reputation at that point because he was the guy who had stopped the genocide. He was seen as a development darling, as it was put, where, he's a good place to invest development aid because he wasn't corrupt. So people tended to believe him. And so we did a second report, a few months later, and showed again how he was supporting the M23. And again, he lied and said, no, I'm not. And it took the third report for finally all the donor governments to get that, yeah, we're telling him the truth, and he's lying through his teeth. At which point, we actually got John Kerry, who was Secretary of State at the time, along with his British counterpart, William Hague, to call Kagame and say, Human Rights Watch is telling us this, we're going to cut off your aid unless you stop supporting the M23. And at that point, Kagame had no choice. And the M23 crumbled in about 3 days. It was just gone. And it was gone for about 8 years. Although in the interim, then Kagame has spent the time trying to make himself indispensable. Because he wanted, the M23, the big advantage for him is that he gets to then mine the minerals of Eastern Congo. It's a very valuable, kind of lucrative industry. And so, he's been sending his peacekeepers to northern Mozambique. He's been, offering the former British government to take their asylum seekers. I think he's offering Trump to take the asylum seekers. He's, builds up his PR by sponsoring Arsenal or Paris Saint-Germain. So he's doing all these things to try to improve his image. And now the M23 is back after an 8-year absence. And so we're going through the same process again. Today, everybody accepts our findings. It's so obvious that Rwanda is back in the M23. The issue is now, how do you convince the donor governments to resume the pressure that last time was successful in getting Kagame to stop? And the trend is positive. They're governments are cutting off aid. I noticed that Trump's Africa envoy I think at this point just wagging his finger said, you got to stop that, Kagame. That didn't do anything. But, I think, this coming back to reputation, I mean, I think Trump would find it shameful that Obama was more successful than he is in stopping Kagame from supporting the M23. That's where we are right now. And if Trump can kind of, revise himself on Iran and in a sense, out of necessity, come back to Obama's strategy, he could maybe do something like that in Eastern Congo as well.
It's an opportunity. So I want to pivot for a second and ask you
Sure.
a question about your travels. At this point, how many countries have you been kicked out of? How many countries are you banned from? Where are you going on vacation?
Yeah. No, I mean, there are a number of countries I cannot go to now. The two I've been kicked out of were Hong Kong and Egypt. And I tell the stories there. I mean, Egypt, it was right after the Rabat Square massacre, where this was when Sisi was still general, he was not yet president, but the Muslim Brotherhood had been overthrown, and they were holding a big sit-in Rabat Square. And the Egyptian military came in, surrounded the square, and in the course of 12 hours, cleared it out and killed 817 people. And so we did a very detailed report on it, and I went to Cairo to release it. And that was not so crazy because I actually had done a number of press conferences in Cairo, but this time they decided no. So they blocked me at the airport, which was dumb on their part because, it was a big press thing that they blocked me. It was like a big advertisement for the report. I still did the press conference anyhow remotely to all the journalists in Cairo, and it was almost like a double whammy. And then the same thing happened a few years later in Hong Kong, where it was at the height of the big pro-democracy demonstrations, and I went to Hong Kong to release Human Rights Watch's annual World Report at the press club there. And the main thesis of the introduction, which I would write every year, was describing the Chinese government as the greatest threat to the global human rights system. And that was not something they wanted me to say. So they blocked me at the airport again and put me on the plane back to New York. Again, completely stupid on their part because I spent the entire flight emailing with journalists. I did a little kind of video, kind of a selfie video as I was being pushed on the airplane, which I think got, 11,000 retweets. And it was a huge promotion for the press conference, which I just did 2 days later at the UN instead of in Hong Kong. And it was packed, So those kind of efforts don't work that well. I've been personally sanctioned by both the Chinese government and the Russian government. I can't go to either of those countries anymore.
No vacations to St. Petersburg and
Not anymore.
So on the topic of China, you actually just got into my next question, which was you open one of the chapters of your book is specifically on China, and you say there's no greater threat to global human rights than the Chinese government and Xi Jinping. You also talk about a broad swath of different nations with their own problems. Why China specifically?
Okay. I don't pretend that China is the worst violator, although it's up there. What they're doing to the Uyghurs is horrible. But China stands alone in terms of the threat it poses to the global human rights system. Because, lots of governments violate human rights. China under Xi Jinping is the only government that is trying to rewrite human rights law. And, human rights law is detailed in these treaties that most governments have ratified, with a lot of specificity about what governments owe their people. And Xi Jinping wants to rip that all up and substitute a three-part test. He wants to ask, are people happy? Which is a meaningless concept in China because there's no independent polling. Is there stability? Which, in his term is repression. And then what he really wants to talk about is the economy growing? Is GDP per capita increasing? And, it has in China. That's, and that's a great, they pulled hundreds of millions out of poverty. But the Xi Jinping conception of this has no role for the individual. It's all about the collective. But in fact, the entire point of human rights is to defend the individual from the collective, to say there's certain things the collective cannot do. And so it's no surprise that Xi Jinping, doesn't want people voting or discussing or writing about what the government should do. So classic civil and political rights are not allowed. But even economic and social rights he doesn't want those either, because those in essence say, they ask, is the government using its available resources to progressively improve the lot of the worst off segments of society? And so that would invite awkward questions about, how are the Uyghurs doing, or how are the Tibetans doing, or how are Han Chinese in rural areas doing? And he doesn't want that either. He just wants, trust me to do the right thing. If the economy is growing, that's all you need to know. That is a radical dumbing down of what human rights standards are. It basically eviscerates human rights standards. And then to make matters worse, he would change the way the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva operates, which in the council, it investigates, it reports, it condemns. It stigmatizes governments. They all hate it. He would end all of that, and he would turn it into a nice, pleasant chit-chat group where each government talks about how on its own, it's finding its own unique path to improve human rights, however those are defined. And so it means, the standards are gone and there's no pressure. There's just conversation. That's, a pretty radical challenge. And nobody other than the Chinese government is posing that.
So like I mentioned earlier, you've had an audience with pretty much every world leader I can think of. Who surprised you? In a good way or a bad way?
Yeah, maybe the most surprising, this is gonna be an odd answer, but is Joseph Kabila, the former president of the Democratic Republic of Congo. And I mean, one kind of fact about him that is not widely appreciated is that he has surrendered more suspects to the International Criminal Court than any other president. Nobody knows that. But he was remarkably concerned about his image. And I remember the first time I met him was in Goma. And he's a bit of an accidental president. His father was president, his father was assassinated. And then the powers that be in Congo thought, oh, let's have the kid do it. He won't rock the boat and we can kind of control the kid. He was like 28 or something. So he became a very young president. And when I met him in Goma, it was funny. It was in an old Mobutu palace on the shore of Lake Kivu. And, we were ushered through this very ornate anteroom out into a white tent on the lawn in the back, heading down to the lake, no sides in the tent, completely exposed. I mean, this is in the middle of a war zone. I kept thinking like, we could be attacked by the rebels here, but nobody else seemed to care, so I just ignored it, And so we're seated, I was with two colleagues on one side of the table. There were three ministers who never said a word on the other side of the table. And then there was at the head of the table, there was a seat for the president. And so we're all seated and then, waiting a couple minutes. And then this kid bops in blue jeans and sits down in the president's chair. And it took me a moment to realize this was Kabila, So, but I was there to release a report that we had done on rape by the Congolese army, because the army was incorporating rebel groups, kind of negotiate with them, and instead of like fighting them forever, they would just incorporate them. And these groups, raped women. So I said, look, these are the three things I want you to do. And I want you to announce zero tolerance, I want you to prosecute the rapists, and I want you to discipline the commanders who are allowing this. And 2 days later, he did it, and it was, and that was the kind of, responsiveness you'd get from him, which is so unlikely. But the weirdest meeting I had with him was a couple years later when he had finished his 2 constitutionally permitted terms. And like so many African leaders, he wanted to stay on. Being president was fun, but he didn't have the clout to change the constitution, which is what other Africans had been doing. So he was doing what the Congolese called a glissement. He was like just sliding in to an extended term. And, there were protests and they were shooting the protesters. And so I went to see him and, my job was to persuade him to step down. And I knew there were a lot of diplomats who were doing the same thing, but they were, operating diplomatically and I could be more candid. So I went in and I said, look at Mr. President, I see you've got two choices before you here. You can keep this glee smoke going and there are going to be more protests and you're going to be shooting more protesters. And, at some point you're going to have to step down. You're going to be hated. You're going to be hounded by prosecutors. This is not going to be nice. That's one route. Or you can, accept a new election, hand power over to a newly elected government, and you will be kind of the founding father of Congolese democracy. You'll be respected. You'll be sent on diplomatic missions and the like. He said that I knew that he, all he really wanted to do was to go to his ranch and play video games. But I tried to make sort of this, sound attractive. And we then talked about this for an hour, and at the end of it, he turned to my colleague and I and said, I don't know what I'm going to do, but pray for me. But ultimately, he accepted that he had to step down. And it was a very imperfect process. There was an election. He had his favorite candidate who lost. The person who clearly won was the person he hated. And it was just agreed he couldn't become president. So they settled on Tshisekedi, who is the current president, who completely lost. But he, arguably came in maybe second, maybe third. And there's just, by agreement, he became the president. And since then, he's actually won an election. So it was an imperfect transition, but, he finally did the right thing. And he tried to control Tshisekedi for a couple of years and now is sort of fading into the background.
And among those leaders, who do you feel has been, I guess, one way to pose this question is, who do you think has been the most sympathetic to your advisement and somebody who's helped advance the human rights priorities that you've tried to push forward?
Look, everybody is partial on this, but I mean, I describe in the book how I really liked meeting with Angela Merkel. And I liked it because she had the self-confidence to want to have a real conversation. There's certain leaders you meet with and they have their talking points and they're kind of scared during the meeting and they don't really go past the talking points. And these are pretty unproductive meetings. But Merkel wanted to have a conversation. And I tell the story in the book how at one point I met with her. I met with her, I think, 4 times over the years. And one meeting I had with her was just after it had been revealed that the US had been bugging her phone, which was awkward. And she was contemplating setting up what was going to be called a Euronet, which would force all data taken from Europeans to stay in Europe. And I said, look at, Madam Chancellor, I get why you want to do this, but I have to tell you, we've been telling, internet companies operating in China, never put your data in China, because once you do that, you lose control over it. And, but if you set up a Euronet, China's going to set up a ChinaNet, and we're going to lose that argument. And she said, I never thought of that. And that was kind of the sort of honesty you got from her, which was remarkable. But I say she was imperfect because I describe in the book 2 big issues we were facing with her just as her term as chancellor was ending. When she also, just coincidentally, Germany had the presidency of the European Union, which is a 6-month rotating thing. And there were 2 big things she was trying to conclude during that 6-month presidency. One was the European Union budget, which is a 7-year budget. And what we were trying to get her to do was to condition the huge subsidies that she gives to Hungary and Poland, that the European Union gives, on their respect for what was called the rule of law, but basically human rights standards and democracy, both of which, Orban in Hungary and the Law and Justice Party in Poland were in the process of undermining. And she, was totally sympathetic, but over the course of about 2 years of conversation on this, she got more and more scared that Orban was going to veto the budget. And that and she needed to get the budget completed during her 6 months. And so she ended up compromising by kind of kicking it to the European Court of Justice, which ultimately ruled in our favor. So there is conditionality, and it helps change the government in Poland. Law and Justice lost. Tusk is now the minister. Orban is still hanging on, but is under real financial pressure. But so she kind of, her heart was in the right place, but she just, wouldn't push all the way to the end. And we had something similar with China, where she was overseeing a big European Union investment deal with China at a point where China was, had, huge numbers of Uyghurs in forced labor. And our point to her was, how can you do this? How can you have an investment deal if European companies are just going to become complicit in Uyghur forced labor? And so she compromised, and she made, she forced her to agree to ratify, treaties banning forced labor, not to stop the forced labor. And that was a kind of a, I thought a pretty meaningless compromise. The whole deal fell apart really because China made the mistake of imposing sanctions on several European parliamentarians, and they just killed the deal, the European Parliament. So there is no deal. But those are examples where, kind of we were working together, we were basically pushing in the same direction, but she was sensitive to the German business community. She was very pragmatic and just didn't want to push too hard.
I want to ask you about Human Rights Watch's foray into domestic human rights. What was the impetus of that? And how has it developed?
Well, when we started off, the assumption was that Human Rights Watch wasn't really needed in the United States because there's the ACLU, there's a strong court system, and that's good enough. And we came to understand that the methodology we developed for countries without the rule of law actually still has a role to play here for issues that are not that susceptible to judicial resolution. And, one obvious example is immigration, where there are many immigration issues where, an undocumented immigrant is not going to want to go to court for fear of deportation. And so the way to address it is by investigating patterns of abuse, writing and addressing it to Congress, or to public opinion. And that, that is a way of supplementing litigation. But where we spend most of our time was on criminal justice issues. And there, kind of by definition, if you're a criminal defendant, you're going to probably get due process. You probably have a fair trial if you get to trial. But what you can't do is challenge certain racist practices that are quite systematic, whether it's the deployment of police forces or the setting of bail or the behavior of prosecutors doing plea bargaining or even, sentencing decisions. And those kinds of, systematic discriminatory practices require what we do. They require, investigations, looking at patterns, looking at statistics, and putting it together and speaking them to Congress and saying, or speaking to state legislatures and saying, look, this is what we're finding here. This is not remedied trial by trial by trial. You need a legislative or policy level response. And that's where we spend most of our time on those kinds of issues.
And could you talk a little bit more about your efforts related to the response to the war on terror?
Well, I describe in the book, first of all, the huge effort we made to stop Bush's torture, which of course Bush never admitted was torture. They just, the famous torture memos essentially redefined torture utterly illegitimately. But the Bush administration claimed that it was okay to use, also prohibited cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment, so long as it was to a non-American held outside the United States. And that was the rationale behind the secret detention, CIA detention facilities in places like, Poland and Lithuania and Morocco and the like. And we, first of all, had to kind of argue to public opinion that torture is, that the prohibition on torture should be enforced. And after 9/11, people were scared. And there was a huge sentiment among many Americans, just do whatever it takes to protect me, you know? And so people were accepting torture. And we needed to argue that torture is not only illegal and wrong, but it's actually ineffective. You know, that if you're seen as torturing, people are not going to cooperate with law enforcement efforts because nobody wants to send somebody to be tortured. And given that, you know, the people who are most likely to know about a potential terrorist incident are people living in the community who might know the would-be terrorists, these are people who are not going to go to the police if they feel that that's about to have their neighbor tortured. So we had to make arguments like that, you know, kind of pragmatic arguments, in addition to the principal arguments, to gradually shift public opinion. What ended up making a huge difference was a young US captain, Ian Fishback, who had served in Iraq and who saw systematic torture, reported it to his superiors, and they told him to just shut up. And so after frustration, he came to us. And we ended up interviewing him and a number of his colleagues and put out a report about this torture by the US described by US service members. And this was super powerful. We brought Ian Fishback, you know, here to Capitol Hill, and he made the rounds. We had been working with Senator McCain, who himself was a torture victim in Vietnam. And he credits Ian Fishback with having produced a veto-proof majority in the Senate, because Bush was threatening to veto. And what we instead got through what was called the Detainee Treatment Act, which closed these loopholes that said you can't use cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment just because it's a foreigner held overseas. And essentially, you know, said torture means torture, and there are no exceptions to it. And that, you know, corresponded really with the end of Bush's torture. You know, that plus Abu Ghraib, which kind of made it just seem almost juvenile. That, you know, made a huge difference. Now, I describe in the book a meeting that I had with Obama early in his tenure, where, you know, the big issue was, would he prosecute the Bush era torturers? And you probably remember this. You know, Obama took this view. You know, basically, we're going to look forward, not back. You know, I'm going to make sure we're no torture. You know, there was no more torture, but we're going to let bygones be bygones. And he did this because he wanted to get Obamacare through. He had various other legislative goals. He was afraid to be too divisive. But the problem is that he left torture as a policy option. You know, he didn't exercise that option, but it's one that's sitting there that, you know, a Trump-like figure could use in the future, because there is now a precedent of impunity for torture. You know, Cheney was never pursued. Bush was never pursued. That the people who deliberately oversaw this policy are home free.
Well, you bring me to my next subject.
Okay.
So this book was finished, sent, ready for publication prior to the start of Trump's second term, right?
I mean, basically, yes. Basically, yes. I mean, I was, you know, I was permitted to kind of note that Trump had won. I could like insert certain little things as long as it didn't change kind of the word is at the bottom of the page. I mean, it was kind of, it was all in galley that I could make the smallest of changes. But basically, yes, the book was done before Trump won.
So here we are, 4 months in, well, about 4 months in. Has the start of this second term changed the way you see the US's role in championing human rights? Has it changed the way you see, I mean, from the dismantling of different agencies, including USAID, DOJ's efforts to make the government more efficient by cutting different departments, cutting access to data, the recent events involving Crimea, and I mean, the list goes on and on, migrants being detained at Guantanamo Bay and then being sent to El Salvador. I mean, what do you think the future holds?
Yeah, well, I mean, let me answer that in terms of both foreign policy and then domestic policy.
Yeah.
I mean, with foreign policy, look, at Trump is just, you can't look to him to defend human rights. That's just not his interest. This is not the first time we faced that. And it was true during the first Trump term, where the answer was to build coalitions of governments that stepped in. And I mean, I describe how we were able to condemn Maduro in Venezuela, I think because Trump was not involved. In other words, if Trump had taken the lead, Maduro could have dismissed this as Yankee imperialism. But without Trump, the effort was led by a group of Latin American democracies plus Canada. It was known as the Lima Group. And the Lima Group was seen as offering a principled defense of democracy. It was super effective. And it got the UN Human Rights Council to, to condemn Maduro, to begin ongoing scrutiny. And wouldn't have happened otherwise. We saw something similar with the Saudi-led coalition's bombing of civilians in Yemen, where, we didn't bother going to the US government, but we worked with the Netherlands foremost, a group of smaller European governments that joined in and successfully created what was known as the Group of Eminent Experts, but basically a commission of inquiry that for 4 years was scrutinizing Saudi conduct, which made it better. By the time when it was finally lifted, the civilian casualties doubled. And it just showed that it was making a huge life and death difference, until finally there was a ceasefire put in place. So we've learned how to work around the United States. And the US is a potentially very powerful and important defender of human rights, but it's not the only one. If you go back to the International Criminal Court, and this was obviously under Clinton, this was not under a Republican administration, Clinton was dead set against having a court that could ever prosecute an American. And that was, US policy for years. They tried every trick in the book to create an exception. And we fought back and did it by replicating the strategy we had done with the landmines campaign. We built a coalition of about 60 small and medium-sized governments that together had the moral clout to stand up to Washington. And in the end, when the final vote happened in Rome to adopt the treaty to create the ICC, we won 120-7. The US was completely alone. It had Israel, China, I mean, it lost. And so there are ways to do this, and it does involve building coalitions. The US is the superpower, but there are other powerful collections of governments that allow us to still defend human rights.
It's very optimistic.
No, and we have to do the same thing now. And I think it's, we're seeing this in Ukraine where the Europeans are like discovering themselves, they're discovering their collective voice. They're no longer just like letting Trump lead. And so I do think, if Trump proceeds with this, ceasefire with no meaningful security guarantee, I think the Europeans are going to say no, and they're trying to kind of work out, is there an alternative? Trump is threatening to just walk away, which probably means, cutting off arms sales and intelligence provision. But, the Europeans are ramping up as quickly as they can. And so are the Ukrainians. That's the interesting thing. As this war has changed into a drone war, the Ukrainians are suddenly not nearly at the disadvantage that they were in the early days.
So how much time do we have there? Good amount of time? Okay, I will ask one more question before I move on to audience. Does that work? Okay, great. So I'm going to have a double-pronged question because I'm a journalist and I ask complicated questions. I apologize. Sort of a rose and a thorn. I'll start with a thorn first. What's keeping you up at night? I'm just going to keep it general.
Well, no, I worry about how Trump is, very much pursuing the autocrat's handbook and is deliberately trying to undercut the checks and balances on his power. And it's obvious what he's doing. He's doing just what Orban has done. He's doing just what Erdogan has done. It's not literally a handbook, but it's, metaphorically one. So we see what the plan is. And we actually know from, successful countries that have fought back, Poland, Brazil, what it takes to fight back, which is, a collective effort where you don't allow the autocrat to pick off potential checks one by one, where you look at the, it's not just journalists or just universities or just this or that, but it's, it's all part of an effort to prevent these checks and balances from operating. And what I worry about is, can that kind of collective defense be mounted here? It's much easier to do it at the outset. If you wait and give them 2 years, it's going to be a lot more difficult. So that, I think, is a big issue. To put it, kind of a more positive spin on this, though, there is a kind of the common wisdom these days is that autocracy is ascendant. And that is a view that is very Western because we're seeing this in a series of established democracies. But if you take a more global perspective, people who live under autocracies almost uniformly want out. And we're seeing this manifested in a series of mass protests in country after country where they're trying to get rid of the autocrat. And so, sometimes they succeed. I mean, they got rid of Sheikh Hasina in Bangladesh. They got rid of the Rajapaksas in Sri Lanka. They got rid of Bolsonaro in Brazil, Law and Justice Party in Poland, in South Korea. They prevented a kind of a self-military coup. So there's sometimes victories, but then there's, Iran and Russia and Belarus and Uganda and Nicaragua where it doesn't work, But even where it doesn't work, the people make clear what they want. So when Xi Jinping says, oh, the Chinese people want the dictatorship of the Chinese Communist Party, you say, well, what about these hundreds of thousands of people in Hong Kong who made clear that that's the last thing they wanted? So that's where I kind of take heart is that, the people who've seen autocracy up front, seen its self-serving nature, they don't want it. But we need to bolster democracy in the West as people are kind of giving up on it because they feel it's not really serving them and they're stagnating. Their life's not improving.
I mean, you just answered the other question I had, which is what reassures you at night? What gives you some sense of calm?
Well, I mean, that, the desire for human rights, for democracy, I think is pretty profound. You never really see people who don't want it. They may not want it for other people, but for themselves, they want it. So that's the moral basis of what we do. In other words, if the whole concept of shaming is premised on a public sense of right and wrong. If you shine a spotlight and people say, oh, that's lovely, you're not going to change misconduct. But I am heartened by the fact that, most people have this sense of right and wrong that does largely correspond with human rights standards. And that is what gives us our power.
So let's move to questions. Polly's got eyes on, yeah. Oh, sorry, she's got the mic back there.
Go ahead. Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, thank you so much for talking to us tonight. So obviously the Human Rights Organization now has a lot of support and it has significant influence, globally, internationally. But in the early days of the organization, how did you manage to create like two-way communications with governments and also maintain credibility when you lacked resources?
Well, I mean, the credibility with government, it was a gradual process, and it really began with the Central American conflicts of the 1980s. Because, the Reagan administration at that stage was portraying US allies, the allied government in Salvador and Guatemala, the Contras in Nicaragua, as freedom fighters, fighting godless democracy, like communists. And these were the same forces that were disappearing people. They were running death squads. So we would investigate and report on those death squads. And, the Reagan people would attack us. Again, we were right. And they, when journalists, nobody knew who we were at that point. We were called America's Watch at that stage, that work done in Central America. Journalists would go to Central America and would find that we told the truth, that our reporting was accurate. And that really established our credibility. It made us, in Washington, suddenly very relevant. So, we would be asked to testify in Congress. Not at the most senior levels of government, but in the State Department at the Assistant Secretary level, they would meet with us. And that began, a process where, our influence grew as our capacity to address more countries, to enlist more countries as potential allies, was broadly recognized. Our media profile increased. By the time I left Human Rights Watch 2.5 years ago, and we were getting 1,000 media mentions a day. So that meant we were able to shine a very intense spotlight. And that adds to your credibility because governments then have to pay attention to you.
Thank you.
And thank you for being here as well. You spoke about country by country. You have, it sounds like pods of researchers and advocates, communications folks, and you've been with Human Rights Watch for many, many years. And in that time, you've created the methodology, you've understood the nuances from country to country, between and among countries, different strategies, etc. And my question is, how do you prepare for your own replacement in a scenario like that?
I've been replaced.
But how did you do it? What considerations did you have? How did you probably had it in your head before you actually pursued it?
Oh, yeah. No, look, I hired my replacement as my number 2. And she ultimately was selected. I have to say, she was just fired a month ago. So I'm not happy with how it turned out. But, and so Human Rights Watch is actually looking for a new executive director right now. But I kind of, as I left, I had to have a succession plan. And so there were, in a sense, 2 dimensions to it. One, which is still very much in place, is that it's an incredibly deep set of talent. We were very successful in hiring super smart, dedicated people. And so there's a very strong culture. There's a deep bench there. But, sadly, the woman who I was hoping the board would select as my successor, and they ultimately did, there was a falling out and it didn't work out. I'm not quite sure if that answers your question, but. I'm not on the board by design. I didn't think that was the right thing to do. I'm sure they're going to consult with me as they narrow the field. Yeah.
First of all, thank you for being here. I really learned a lot as somebody who aspires a career in human rights. So I was just curious. My question is, you mentioned that how human rights is progressing, and that also means a good thing, but also there are like other things that are being developed, like R2P, responsibility to protect. How do you like see maybe countries misusing it? Is it a threat, or what is the scope of R2P? What would your thoughts
Yeah.
be on it?
Well, I talk about R2P, and for those who don't know, R2P stands for the responsibility to protect. And it was the concept developed, essentially, codifying humanitarian intervention. So, when is it okay to use military force to stop mass atrocities? And I have to say, I was a believer in R2P. And what finally turned me off of it was, Libya, where it was, cited for what at first was really just to stop a threatened bloodbath in Benghazi, but it turned into regime change and left chaos. And arguably chaos is worse than a dictatorship. And then, of course, Bush's misuse of humanitarian intervention as a belated justification for his invasion of Iraq, when it turned out that the weapons of mass destruction were a fiction. So those 2 cases of regime change, both of which turned out pretty disastrously, really discredited R2P. And so it isn't an active concept these days. It's not something that really has much viability. I talk in the book about, there are a few cases where Human Rights Watch has advocated military intervention. The one unsuccessfully was to stop the Rwandan genocide, which just didn't happen. But we successfully sought it to stop the genocide in Bosnia, to stop the kind of war-induced starvation in Somalia, and to prevent a recurrence of the genocide against the Kurds in Iraq, the so-called Anfal genocide that was threatened again. But when, post Libya, post Iraq, the place where we thought seriously about seeking military intervention was in Syria. When what was on the table was, should we bomb the airfields that were being used to launch the flights that were dropping barrel bombs on civilians? And I actually favored doing that, but my staff really wasn't sure. They were worried about the repercussions. You know, if Assad toppled, would ISIS take over? And so we ended up not doing it. And these days, it's not an active doctrine at Human Rights Watch anymore. I'm sorry, what?
What is the efficacy of it? Can it be?
Well, I mean, I think that, you know, you can still imagine a situation where, I mean, take the Rwandan genocide, where, you know, I wish there had been intervention because, you know, the genocidaire, they used, you know, machetes. This was not, you know, a sophisticated army. And my late colleague, Alison DeForge, who was this brilliant researcher on Rwanda, you know, figured out that really if you took, on the one hand, UNAMIR, which was the name of the UN peacekeeping force that was already on the ground, if you gave them the mandate combined with the French extraction force that went in to pull out all the Westerners, and just told them to stop the genocide, they could have stopped the genocide. But they were never given that order. They pulled the Westerners, you know. They were, in fact, the UN reduced the number of peacekeepers. So that's a situation where I think military intervention could have been targeted and super effective to prevent 800,000 people being slaughtered. But it's rare to have a situation that is that clear cut.
Thank you again so much for coming to speak with us tonight. How did or does it affect your work when you are working with a situation that's like ongoing, that's developing, where there are people who are having their rights suppressed or people are actively losing their lives? How does that affect your work when you are trying to prevent this or report on it or like let the world know that this is happening?
I mean, how did it kind of affect you personally, or?
Both you and I'm assuming it doesn't affect like the way you report it, but the urgency you feel in.
Oh, well, I mean,
the work you
certainly if
do.
there's ongoing killing, I mean, that's a, you know, huge priority. And so, you know, this emergency team that I set up, which was, you know, partly designed to just have a group of war experts who could be, you know, dropped into a war zone, but they also provided a surge capacity. And so, you know, if you're the one researcher on the country, which typically all there was, you know, and your country blows up in war, you need help. And the emergency team could provide that assistance. And then, you know, a lot of the central staff, so, you know, the advocates in different capitals, the communications people, they were all quite flexible. And you could, you know, so you could throw a bunch of people at a problem. So if you had, you know, the height of the Syrian war or Ukraine or Gaza, these are things where you could kind of beef up. And even though you only had one researcher, you could build a team around them that allowed, you know, much more intense work for a period.
Go for it.
Hi there. Thank you so much for coming and speaking with us and sharing your depth of knowledge. As someone that's also interested in pursuing a career in human rights, I'm really curious in how your background as a lawyer and someone that was working in law for quite a bit of time informed your current experience working in human rights.
All right, well, let me answer your question maybe a little bit differently from what you're asking, because I want to stress you don't have to be a lawyer to do this work. Okay, I mean, I happen to be a lawyer, but you know, if you look at who we hire, yes, there are lawyers, but there are a lot of journalists, there are a lot of academics, a lot of people who just have an activist background. We look much more for a skill set than we do for a particular degree. And the skill set we want is, you know, people who have the means to conduct an investigation and report on it accurately and well. So that requires, you know, linguistic skills. It requires familiarity with operating in, you know, in difficult countries. It requires, you know, an ability to maintain objectivity and to put aside your personal political preferences and just call it the way it is. And then it requires, you know, a certain drive. You know, you got all this information now, how are you going to make a difference with it? Because we look to the researchers really to kind of devise an advocacy strategy. They're the ones who are often meeting with government officials. They're the ones who presumptively speak to journalists. And so it's an interesting job. I mean, there are a lot of different dimensions to it. And we look for people who can, as much as possible, show the capacity to do those different parts of the job.
Thank you.
All right, well, I want to thank the Brademas Center and NYU for facilitating this incredible conversation. I want to thank all of you for being here today. And thank you so much to Mr. Ken Roth. And he has copies of his book upstairs. Thank you, everybody, for being
Take care.
here.